I was reading a story about a woman named Hillary Harris, who was adopted when she was an infant and never knew who her birth parents were. The court records were sealed. She didn't know them at all. She didn't really have any clue about them. And she wanted to know them, but she had wonderful adoptive parents, and she had just never gone to try and find out more until she was in her 20s and she got married to a guy named Lance, and she became pregnant, and now she wanted to know her health history so she could be prepared and talk to the doctors. So she went and petitioned, got all her records unsealed, and learned who her mother and father were. They had been separated, and she found out her father had recently died. But she also found out that she had a half-sister named Dawn Johnson who lived in and was from a town just a few towns away in Wisconsin where she lived. And so she set out to try and find this Dawn Johnson. She went, the first place most of us would go right now in this day and age is Facebook, and looked up Dawn Johnsons. And there's millions of Dawn Johnsons. And for those of you who are from Boston, I'm not saying Don Johnson, the actor. I'm saying Dawn, the female, Dawn Johnson. And so she's looking Facebook, and there's just too many. She can't figure out which one is her sister. She has no idea what she even looks like. She finds out the sister's actually 20 years almost older than her, so who knows? And so for a year, she keeps trying to look. She and her husband together are trying to look and look and look, and they're not finding her. Then one day, someone moves in next door, new neighbors, and her husband, who is very friendly, Lance, he decides, I'm going to go out and say hi to them. Hillary was more of a shy person, so she stayed inside. But her husband runs out into the yard, goes across, and meets the wife of this new couple moving in, and comes back inside. And Hillary says, "Oh, she seemed nice. What was her name?" And he says, "That was Dawn. I think she's from Greenwood." And Hillary says, wait a minute. When we were looking at my sister, it said that she was from Greenwood. Remember, Dawn from Greenwood? Do you think, what are the chances? And her husband's like, I don't know, let's go ask her. But Hillary was really shy. And so she said, no, because, it's probably not. I mean, there's how many Dawns in the world, and even from that town. And, what if it is her, but it's a secret, and I'm not supposed to know? And so she just let it go. But every day she'd watch out her window and watch this new neighbor who was maybe her older sister. And then one day a couple pallets of shingles arrived. And on the side was a sign with the last name of these new neighbors. It was Johnson. So now she's like, okay, she's Dawn from Greenwood, and her last name is Johnson. And her husband's like, it has to be her. We're going over there right now and talking to her, and kind of dragged her, and they went across. And Hillary walked up to Dawn and just kind of stood there, really close to her, awkwardly close, and didn't say anything, just kind of noticed she has curly hair like me. She has freckles like me. Her complexion looks like me. But she's just so painfully shy and scared and worried that she didn't say anything. She had a little baby at the time, and she went back inside. They said goodbye, and Dawn was like, well, that was a weird encounter. And then later that day, Hillary started texting Dawn with some of the information she'd found from the unsealed court records, because there was information about her and things she had done and whatever. So she said, hey, were you in this fair? And Dawn's like, well, that's weird. Why would you even ask that? But yeah. And after a while of just a whole bunch of weird texts, finally, Dawn just called her and said, wait a minute, do we have the same dad? And they did. It was her sister that she'd been looking for a year, that she had been missing all her life, but didn't know she even had. And so they met out in the driveway, and they hugged, and Hillary says, I'll never forget that moment. It was a miracle as we embraced in the driveway. And then from that day on, they were inseparable. They were at each other's side every day. Hillary, the aunt of her baby, kind of became almost more like a grandmother, and they're just living life together now, celebrating that they're home together. They have each other. Can you just imagine the longing you would feel knowing you have someone who's connected to you, belongs to you, but they're lost to you? Can you imagine the longing you'd feel? And can you imagine the joy you'd have at finding that person and being reunited to them? Not just, oh, I know they exist, but no, now you're together again, family. Can you imagine that? Last month we spent our time talking about how to love one another as a church family. This month we're talking about how to love our neighbor, how to reach our neighbor, how to love our neighbor. Our neighbors, let me define it for us. Our neighbors are the people around us who don't know Jesus. Loving our neighbors, if we're going to really love them, begins with how we view them, how we see them. And the way we see them should be the way Jesus sees them. Are you following me? We're called to love our neighbors, love these people who don't know Jesus. To love them begins with how we see them. We should see them the way Jesus sees them. So how does Jesus see them? There were several instances in Scripture where people came after Jesus because of the people he was spending time with and said, what are you doing? Why are you spending time with these people? And his answer was, I have come to seek and save the lost. Jesus sees them as lost. And that means, if you put all that together, that we can't, and we almost definitely won't, love our neighbors until we see them the way that Jesus sees them, and Jesus sees them as lost. So until you and I learn to see our neighbors as lost, we won't be able to truly love them and reach them. Now, I know that word lost is an uncomfortable word. It feels insulting. If you walk up to your neighbor and say, hey, dude, you're lost, the response probably won't be great to that. Because lost typically means, for us especially today, that you're confused, you don't know what you're doing, you're stupid, or you're a lost cause. It's a way of saying you're not worth it. And there's a great example of this actually in Scripture in Luke chapter 15. I'm not going to put the scriptures on the screen today because there's a lot we're going to read through, but you can follow along in our app and take notes, or just open your own Bible to Luke chapter 15. And this is what it says. Now the tax collectors and sinners, they kept hanging around Jesus. They were gathered around Jesus. But then the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the very religious people, they were muttering and murmuring. Look at this guy. Look at him. He just lets all these sinners come and hang around with him. He welcomes them. He's even eating with them. Doesn't he know better? So what's their mindset toward these people? They see them as lost, but when they see them as lost, they mean lost cause. Don't waste your time with them. It's not, you're just making yourself unclean. You're just tainting yourself. That's what lost means to them. But that's not what lost means to Jesus. And Jesus turns around and responds to them. And his response is going to show us that for Jesus, lost never means a lost cause. A lost person is never a lost cause to Jesus. And he tells them these three stories that I'm going to share with you. First one is this. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and he goes home, and then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. And then he says, I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who don't need to repent. And look, you've probably heard that story and these others we're going to read today 1,000 times. But let me ask you this, because what happens is when you've heard stories thousands of times, or even hundreds of times, or even 5 times, we tend to start tuning them out. So let me ask you this. Have you ever looked at this story and let it shape the way you view your neighbor? See, I think that's how we want to look at these stories today. Let these stories speak to you and me about how we see our neighbors, because that is going to be the key to learning how to love them and reach them. So let's look closely at this story and see what are the steps, what's Jesus trying to say, what are the steps that lead to this celebration at the end? Because it's not all about the celebration. There's steps along the way. So here they are. The shepherd, first of all, he sees that the sheep is lost. He sees that the sheep is lost. He doesn't pretend, oh, it's just fine wandering around wherever it went. It's it's okay. It's just doing its own thing. He doesn't pretend that's fine. He acknowledges it's dangerous out there. There are predators that are going to kill it and eat it and devour it. And he says there is a relationship. It's my sheep. He belongs with me. I should be taking care of him. And that relationship is missing right now. That sheep is going the wrong way. So he sees that the sheep is lost. And he doesn't pretend otherwise. And then the next thing he does is he searches. He refuses to just say, that stupid sheep. He wanders off every day. I'm done with him. He doesn't treat him like a lost cause. Instead, he goes looking because he loves that sheep and he longs to be reunited with that sheep and have it back. So he sees the reality that the sheep is lost. He then searches because he loves it and longs for it. And then when he finds it, he celebrates. When they're back home together, he celebrates like it's the greatest thing that ever happened in the world. And so what do we learn? From the sheep's perspective, to be lost means to be in danger. It means to not be going in the direction you should be going. It means you're wandering off into a world where you're going to get devoured. From the sheep's perspective, that's what it means to be lost. From Jesus' perspective, when he calls that sheep lost, when that shepherd calls that sheep lost, what he's saying is that to be lost means to be loved and to be longed for. That's what Jesus means when he says lost. Loved and longed for. Loving our neighbor means seeing that they're lost and need to turn around and go toward Jesus, not the direction they're going. And it means searching for them because we love them and we long for them. And we celebrate them when they turn to Jesus. To call someone lost means we're calling them loved and longed for. Then he tells a story of a lost coin. He says, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. Let's have a big party. I found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. That might sound silly to throw a party over one coin. And you may not be picturing this right. If you're picturing your own house, and you think, well, if I dropped a silver coin, I'd find it in my house. Most of you would. Some of you wouldn't. Teenagers with your rooms, I've heard stories. But you got to picture what her house would have been like. And I've stood in these houses in Israel that would have been like her house. And they're made of all stone. The floor is stone. It's like cobblestone and big and small stones all mixed up. So there's cracks and crevices everywhere, nooks and crannies everywhere. And so to drop a coin among those cracks and crevices, it's not easy to find. It's not easy to find because they don't have windows like we have windows. Their walls are about this thick or thicker. And on the window openings on the outside are maybe the size of my hand. And then they get wider as you come in because if you make them bigger, people can slip through and come steal your stuff. So the picture of the light that would come through would just be a shaft of light, not a lot of light. And those oil lamps aren't going to cast a lot of light. So this woman is down feeling and sweeping to hear the jingle of the coin. She is searching to find this thing. And every time they excavate these houses, they find constantly lost coins and stuff down in the cracks among all the floor rocks. So you got to picture this woman on her hands and knees, feeling and sweeping and trying to see and find this coin. And then what is Jesus saying again through all this? The woman sees that the coin is lost. She had it, and now she doesn't have it. And that's not okay. That's a bad thing. The coin is not better off to be wherever it is. It's in danger of never being used for the purposes for which it was created. That's what's happening there to that coin. And so she desperately wants to find it. It's not okay being lost. And then the woman, again, searches. She doesn't just forget about the coin and say, I got 9 others, never mind. Hey, you know what, God, let's call that my tithe. You can find that coin. She doesn't do that. She doesn't treat it like a lost cause. She gets down in the dirt until she finds it. And then when she does, she celebrates and throw a I found my coin party. She invites the neighborhood in because the coin was incredibly valuable to her. She loved it, and she longed to have it back with her. So again, to be lost in Jesus' mouth, when he says someone is lost, he means they are loved and they are longed for. And when you see something with love and with longing, you search for it when it's lost, and you celebrate it when it's found. Because your neighbors were created by God for a purpose. And until they've turned to God and are following Jesus, they're not living out that purpose. And that's not okay. For them, that's not okay. And we need to be the kind of people who aren't going to pretend that's fine, to pretend they're okay, or just ignore them as lost causes, or just ignore and pretend that it's not a big deal that they're just wandering around or not close to God. It's not okay. Instead, we need to be the kind of people who are going to go in and do an all-out search and try and win them back to God, shine God's light in their life. The third story is probably one of the most famous stories in human history, and it's a little different from the first two. It's the story of a lost son and brother. This is how it goes. It says, Jesus continued and said, "There's a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So the father divided it between the 2 sons. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country and squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to feed pigs in the field, and he longed to fill his stomach with something, even just the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything to eat. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'm going to set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and began to go toward his father's house. But while he was still a long way off, not 100 feet, a long way off. You stand on a rooftop in that type of country, you can see for miles. A long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, and bring a ring and put it on his finger. In other words, he's restored to the family. That's what those things mean. Get the fattened calf, the one we've been fattening up for a big party, and kill it, and let's eat it, let's celebrate, let's feast. For this son of mine was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found. And so they began to celebrate. And that sounds like that should be the end of the story, right? Because that matches the sheep story, that matches the coin story. There was a lost person this time, and he's found, and they celebrate. But it's not the end of the story. There's another part. Jesus goes on. He says, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard the music and the dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? And the servant told him, your brother has come home. Your father killed the fattened calf because he is so happy to have him back safe and sound. And then the older brother got angry, and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father and said, look, all these years I have been slaving for you, and I have never disobeyed your orders even once, yet you never even gave me a young goat to just celebrate with my friends. But then this son of yours, not my brother, this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, and you kill the fat calf for him. And the father says, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Now, those first two stories, you've got a lost animal and a lost coin. In this story, you've got a lost person. And as soon as you introduce a lost person, everything gets more complicated, doesn't it? It's easy to love and long for things. Why is it so hard sometimes to love and long for people? In this story, instead of just having one subject, a woman or a shepherd, We have two. We have a father and an older brother. And Jesus wants us to understand they each represent two different approaches. One represents a loving approach towards seeing people as lost, and the other represents an unloving approach towards seeing people as lost. The father acts like the shepherd and the woman did. He sees that his young son is lost, but doesn't see him as a lost cause. He doesn't pretend it's fine that his son is off living that way. He's just choosing his own path. He doesn't pretend it's okay, that the sin and rebellion are good. He recognizes and sees his son is lost and he's not home with him, and that breaks his heart. And so every day he searches. Every day he goes up on that roof and he scans the horizon looking for his son to come home. And the day he sees him way, way, way off, he lifts up his robes, which we've learned since then, thankfully, because of research and all that was an incredibly embarrassing thing for an older, dignified man to do, and they never would do it. They would never lift up their robes and start running. They just never did it in that culture. And what it showed is he didn't care about what anybody thought. He didn't care about how he looked. He didn't care about his own dignity. He lifted up his robes and he just took off running to his son because he wanted to search for him and get him and bring him home. And when he had his son back, he throws a giant celebration and party. He puts that robe on him and that ring on him, which means forget your nonsense about being a servant. You're my son. You're my son. You're my son. Because to that father, when he called his son lost, what he meant is he is loved and he is longed for. The dark tragedy of this story is the older brother. Because the older brother refuses to see his younger brother as lost, loved, and longed for. Instead, he sees him as a loser. He sees him as a waste of time. He sees him as a lost cause. And so when his brother returns, he doesn't celebrate because he never loved him and he never longed for him. He can't even call him his brother. And in the end of these three stories now, this last one that's so different, it's the older brother who ends up lost, left outside of the Father's house. And so what's Jesus trying to say to us? What was Jesus trying to say to those people who were questioning him and the people he was spending time with? He's saying, I'm here to do what that older brother should have done. I'm here searching for the lost because I see they're lost and I want them back. I long for them and I love them. And when they turn around and stop running away from me, I am going to embrace them and pull them into the giantest party in heaven that you could imagine because I love them and I long for them and want them to come home. And then staring into the eyes of all those people there who thought he was wasting his time on these lost causes, Jesus says, this is what his point to them is. Those who join me in loving and longing for the lost people and in searching for them, whatever that takes, even climbing into pig pens or getting on our hands and knees and digging in the dirt and celebrating them when they return. Not, well, let's see if it lasts. He says they have a place in God the Father's house. But those who won't do that don't. So how do you see the people around you? How do you and I look at the people around us? Do we see them as lost? They may look like they've got their life together. You know, you look at their house and it looks well kept. You look at their yard and they're on top of things. You look at their family and it seems happy. Their marriage seems good. They've got a good job. They're responsible, right? They don't park in your area of the street. Right? You may think this person's got it going. They're okay. But they're not. They're away from God, and that means they're lost, and it's not okay. They're not living for the purposes they were created for, and they're never going to be home until they're home with God. And it would be very easy for you and I to just look at the people around us and think, they're okay. There's no major tragedies here. But there is. They're lost. And that's not saying they're foolish or lost causes. It's saying you love them and you long to see them return to God. And so we search for them. Are you searching for them? Are you searching for them? Seeing them as not worth the time to go and talk to, share life with, to ask questions of, to talk about Jesus with? Do you see them as lost because you and I aren't going to be able to love our neighbor until we see them the way Jesus sees them? Jesus sees them as lost, but what he means by that is that they are longed for and loved. And when you see someone as loved and longed for, you're going to go searching for them and try your best to shine a light into their life. You're going to go, even if it means getting into a pig pen, to be there with them and try and help them find Jesus. You're going to search for them and you're going to celebrate them. Look, those of you watching, those of you sitting here, if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're watching this or listening to me here and sitting here, and you know what it means to be a Christian, but you're not, you may call yourself a Christian even, but you're not following Jesus. You're not in this constant relationship with him that's guiding your life every day, where you're living out the purposes that he's made you for and experiencing God as your Father and that relationship, then understand Jesus sees you as lost. And that doesn't mean confused or stupid or a lost cause. It means that he longs for you and he loves you and wants to bring you home, because your heart will always be dissatisfied and broken, and all the joy and fun you have right now is going to run out. The only real lasting peace and joy you'll ever find is when you're home with God who made you. And so when Jesus says you're lost, understand what he's saying is, he's not saying you're left behind. He's not saying forget about you. He's saying he loves you and longs for you, and he wants you to turn around. Stop wandering away from him. Stop squandering your life and discover life in him. That's what he's saying to you today. And for those of us who are Christians following Jesus, and we consider ourselves to be disciples of Jesus and want to live for him, and we want to love our neighbors, then church, today's a day for you and I to examine, how are we looking at the people around us? And to take these three stories, and maybe you've never thought of them this way, but they are a filter for you and I to use to help us look at the people around us and help guide the way we look at the people around us and show us how to see them as lost, as longed for, as loved, to search for them. And if you're tempted not to, then ask Jesus to open your eyes. Worship team, would you come back? Ask Jesus to open your eyes. If you're tempted to think that they're a lost cause, then ask Jesus to break the hardness of your heart and breathe new life into you so that you can see the people around you the way he sees them and love them the way he loves them. It's time to recognize our neighbors are lost, but see them and say that the way Jesus said it. It means you long for them, you love them, and you want to bring them back. That's what we're calling us. That's what God's word is calling us to do today, to love them and long for them. Would you stand with me here and at home? And the team, we're just going to sing this song, asking God to bring a revival in our church, in our nation, in this time among his people. Heal our hearts, open our eyes so we can see things the way you see them, Lord. Raise us up to be a generation that loves the lost, we pray.